I have a question here about sexual desire. And I'm not going to read the whole question, I'll put it in the description. I'm going to paraphrase it because it centers on three topics. First of all, is sex an anti-spiritual activity? Will it slow down or hinder your spiritual growth? And can it prevent you from, if you have an unfulfilled sexual desire, can it prevent you from ascending? And if you have this unfulfilled desire for sex, can you resolve it in between embodiments, or do you have to come back into physical embodiment to resolve it? So obviously sex is a very big topic, so I'm not having any ambition I can cover all aspects of it in one answer, so feel free to ask me other questions about it. But what I would like to start with is this question. Why is there such a stigma around sex? I've been involved with several spiritual movements, and even spiritual people who can talk about all kinds of topics often find it difficult to talk about sex. It's like they don't really want to touch it, don't really want to talk openly about it. So why is there this stigma? You look at sex, it's a physical activity. It's an activity you do with the physical body. So why is there more stigma related to sex than sleeping, eating, taking a walk, doing many other things we do with the physical body? Why is it sex that has such a special status, not only in individual people's minds, but also in society? So I'm just going to let that question hang because I'll answer it in the end. But just to consider it. And then I want to look at the fact that we can't really talk about spirituality and sex without looking at a historical context. Because if you look back, you'll see that in the West, you have the Catholic Church, who for centuries had this, dysfunctional attitude to sex. First of all, you have the whole tradition that the really spiritual people should be monks and nuns and abstain from sex. But then you had this whole stigma of original sin, which was probably caused because Adam and Eve had sex. And therefore we are all conceived in sin because our parents had sex. So there's something inherently sinful about sex. Then you go to the East, where you look in Hinduism and Buddhism going back thousands of years. You also have this tradition that sex is an anti-spiritual activity. It's something you should avoid doing. And the most spiritual people withdraw from society and live as monks or nuns. And they focus all of their attention and time and energy on so-called spiritual activities. And they avoid the non-spiritual activities, especially sex. So why do we have this? Is there something to it, or is it just an artificial thing that was created? Well, it's actually both. But in order to understand this, I think we have to first take a look at desire in general. And let's start with what I have talked about in several of my videos. I especially talk about it in the video about how the world was created. So let's start with the fact that there are two basic states of consciousness that are available to us as human beings on Earth. And the one is that we can see ourselves as connected beings, where we know and experience we are connected to something outside of ourselves, which is primarily our higher self, but also our spiritual teachers, the Ascended Masters. So this is one state we can be in. We are connected beings, and we are walking a systematic step-by-step path for increasing our connection, leading to a sense of oneness. But the other option we have is that we can go into a lower state of consciousness, which is what I call the consciousness of separation, which is based on the duality consciousness, where there's always two opposite polarities. So, now let's look at sexual desire. We have a physical body. It has certain functions. One of them is it produces hormones, and hormones gives rise to a physical desire for sex, a purely physical desire for sex. Just like we have a desire to eat, how do we look at this desire depending on whether we are connected beings or separate beings, whether we see ourselves as connected beings or separate beings? Well, when we go into this state of separation, as I've also explained in other videos, we feel a sense of loss. We don't know where the loss comes from. We don't understand that. But we feel a sense of loss. We feel incomplete. And that means we now have a longing. And that longing really is a longing to get back to the sense of connection to our higher selves. Because the only thing that can really fulfill our desires, really make us feel fulfilled and peaceful, is oneness with our higher self. This is who you really are. And the only thing that's ultimately going to satisfy any desire, basically, is oneness with your higher self. But when you go into separation, you can't achieve oneness. You can't be separate and one at the same time. It's impossible. But also, you don't realize that what you are longing for is oneness. So this means you go into what I have called this compensation game. You are constantly seeking to compensate for this loss of connection, by doing something in this world. Think about that. Let that sink in. And you can apply it not just to sexual desires, but any desires. Because what you see in many people is that a desire becomes obsessive compulsive. And with that I mean that, first of all, people feel like they have to do it. They have to have the fulfillment. They have to do the activity that the desire is aimed at. If it's sexual desire, they have to have sex. But it also becomes an unfulfillable desire. It's a black hole. It's never enough. And just look at many people in the world, how they have a sexual desire that is unfulfillable. And it can never be enough. And so this is what happens to desires when we go into separation. In essence, what we're trying to do is use some activity in the physical world to gain either some sense of connection or oneness or relief from our sense of loss. So we take our attention away from the sense of loss. And sex is unique in that respect because you're having a physical union with another person's body. And it's very close, and you can, in brief moments during orgasm, feel a sense of oneness with the other person, or you're at least covering over that sense of loss. So you can have a glimpse of what it means to be connected to your higher self. But if you don't realize that what you are really longing for is connection to your higher self, then you just get trapped in this unfulfillable desire. And this is what you see with many people who are addicted to sex. And there's a growing awareness that sex can be an addiction, and that many people, especially men, are addicted to sex. So if you look at it from this perspective, right, we have unfulfillable desires and we have fillable desires. Then you gain a different perspective, because now you can say, well, does that mean that sex is always an unfulfillable desire? And like many spiritual people would say, and no, it's not. You can have what you would call it, spiritual desire for sex, because why are we in physical embodiment on a planet like Earth? Because we have a higher self, I call it the I Am Presence, which at some point looked down upon Earth. It resides in the spiritual realm. It looked down upon Earth, and it had a desire to do something on Earth and to experience what you can experience on Earth. And that means that the I Am Presence can have a desire to experience what you can do with a physical body, including sex, or eating, or building a house, or gardening, or whatever it may be. Lots of activities you can only do with a physical body, at least on this planet. And the I Am Presence can have a legitimate desire to experience this. But here's the difference. The I Am Presence has a desire to experience something. And when the I Am Presence has had a critical mass of experiences, it will feel fulfilled. It will feel, this was enough. I've experienced enough of this. For example, you can have people who, in past lifetimes, they have experienced enough sex, and therefore in this lifetime, they don't have a desire for it. And therefore it's perfectly legitimate for them to withdraw from society or abstain from sex. You can also have people who, when they're younger, they have a sexual desire, but when they get older, they can come to a point where they feel like, that's enough. I don't really have the desire anymore. And that's perfectly fine. But what you see is that many people who are into separation, and most people on the planet are trapped in separation to varying degrees of depth into separation, become various degrees of selfishness. They have an unfulfillable desire for sex. And it's obviously fed by modern society, advertising, pornography, movies that feed on this desire, because as the saying is, sex sells. So many people get trapped in it. So what I'm getting to with this is that we can look at sexual desire in two ways. There is a legitimate, fillable desire for sex, and there is an unfulfillable, obsessive-compulsive desire for sex. So back to the question, is sex anti-spiritual? Well, that depends. If you have this unfulfillable desire for sex, you could say that's anti-spiritual because it's going to detract from your spiritual growth. You know, it's going to pull you into activities that eat up your attention, eat up your energies. Your energies will tend to go to the lower vibrations, and this pulls you away from spiritual growth, where you are striving to raise your consciousness. An addiction to sex will lower your consciousness, make you more focused on the outer self, and that's against your spiritual growth. But a legitimate desire is not against your spiritual growth, because coming to that saturation point where you had enough of something, this is part of your spiritual journey, part of your reason for taking embodiment. There are in fact some spiritual teachers that say that there are basically two ways to grow spiritually. One is the way of the yogi, or the one who withdraws from society and abstains from physical activities. The other is the way of a person who indulges in physical activities until he or she has had enough of them. And some would say that either way can be effective, depends on where you're at individually. So my approach to this is that you have to learn, basically you have to learn to feel intuitively when something is draining your energy or lowering your energy. Sexual desire is often centered around the base chakra. I haven't talked so much about it, but I assume many spiritual people are realizing we have these 7 energy centers in our energy field that are called chakras. And there's one that is aligned with the sexual organs along the spine. And you can actually learn to feel if you have a disturbance in your base chakra, if you have lower energies of your base chakra, or if energies are being sucked out of your base chakra. Now, when we go a little bit deeper with this, considering desires, we also have to say that, as I also explained in several other videos, that we human beings, we are co-creators, and we have co-creative abilities. So through our attention, we formulate mental images, we allow energy from our higher selves to stream through our 4 lower bodies, our identity, mental, emotional, bodies into the physical, and that energy is then expressed through our chakras. And we have a basic choice. We can qualify energies with a love-based vibration, which means we can do something with them in the physical, even a physical activity, but the energies will be of a higher vibration, so they will raise up to our higher selves, which means they will be multiplied, and we get more and more creative energy. The other option is that we qualify the energies with a fear-based vibration, a lower vibration, which means they can't rise up. And that's when they then begin to accumulate in our energy fields, accumulate in our chakras. And this, on an individual basis, ties us into what humankind has created collectively. Because as I also explained, we have an individual energy field, but there's also a collective energy field. And in that collective energy field, people have accumulated over time these fear-based energies. And because we have consciousness, we are imbuing those energies with a certain consciousness, and we create what I've called entities, collective entities. And the collective entities can pull on us. They can pull on us individually. If we have fear-based energy in our own energy field, the collective field can pull on it. And so you have these collectively created entities that want to pull people into giving them more energy. For example, smoking. There's a smoking entity, there's an alcohol entity, there's a drug entity, and there's a sex entity. So when you go into separation, when you go into this unfulfillable sexual desire, what happens is you are tying yourself into this collective entity. And the collective entity, it has a certain rudimentary consciousness and survival instinct. But it's like a computer, it's just acting on your programming. So if you're vulnerable to it, it is projecting into you, you should have more sex. And that's what gives you this sense that it's never enough, because you can never fill that entity. It's a black hole. No matter how much energy you gave it individually, it will never be full and it will never leave you alone. So, you know, it's a merry-go-round, it's a treadmill. It just sucks you in and wants to keep you there. So this is, of course, also anti-spiritual, because it pulls your energies out of your energy field, where you need those energies in your field in order to raise your consciousness. Okay, so what can you then do? Well, if you have been or are addicted to sex, you can consider this difference between legitimate desire and unfulfillable desire. And you need to realize that you no doubt have an unfulfilled desire for sex that is a legitimate desire. It's a fillable desire, but it hasn't been filled yet. But what has happened is that you have been pulled into this vortex, maelstrom in a collective consciousness, and that has now turned your fillable desire into an unfillable desire. And you need to break that spiral. And if you're open to Ascended Masters, the easiest way to do this is to call to the Ascended Masters, call to Archangel Michael for protection, call to Elohim Astrea to cut you free from this entity. And you can call to Saint Germain for the violet flame to transmute the fear-based energies in your base chakra. You can also call to Mother Mary, who represents the Divine Mother for all people on earth, and you can help her purify your base chakra. You can even, when you have a sexual desire, you can visualize a white light over your base chakra that penetrates your base chakra and consumes all lower energies. Or you can visualize Mother Mary taking command over your base chakra, even her image over your base chakra, and it can often lessen the sexual desire. But in the long run, you need to realize that you need to decide that you are not going to be pulled into this unfulfillable desire, this obsessive-compulsive desire for sex. And therefore, you are going to tune in to your higher self intuitively and get a feel for what is the fillable desire that hasn't been filled. What is that? In other words, you want to come to a point where your sexual desire is not magnified or pulled on by any outside force. It's an internal thing. It's between you and your higher self. That's where you want to get to. And you can get there with the help of the Ascended Masters. Perhaps people can get to it in other ways, but this is what has been the most effective that I know of. So once you get there, you can know intuitively, do I have an unfulfilled desire? And then just have sex in a responsible way that doesn't harm other people. And don't feel bad about it. Don't feel guilty about it. Especially for younger people, it's natural that you have an unfulfilled desire, and so what? Find yourself a partner who feels the same way, and don't feel guilty about it. So what we can say here is that if you have the unfulfillable, the obsessive compulsive desire, yes, that's anti-spiritual. It's going to pull you away from it. But if you have a legitimate desire, this is not anti-spiritual. Somehow, you need to fill that desire before you can ascend from earth, because it's a desire that relates to the physical body. And now again, if you look at these old spiritual traditions, they will say, many of them, especially in the East, but even in the West you have this. So I talk about this in some of my non-duality videos about what is the purpose of life. And what has happened on planet Earth is that our approach to spirituality has been screwed up by this idea that everything in the world is anti-spiritual. But the world is not anti-spiritual. The world is an environment where we can experiment with our co-creative abilities, we can have experiences, and by doing that, we are growing spiritually. We are expanding our sense of self. We are expanding ourself. That's the whole purpose of the world. That's why the world was created, for our growth in consciousness. So partaking in the kind of activities you can do on a planet like Earth is not in itself anti-spiritual. So this means that there are people, and I have met them, some of them, who have this attitude, sex is anti-spiritual, you should abstain from it. But the I Am Presence still has an unfulfilled desire for sex. So they are now, with their outer minds, with the conscious mind down here, they are forcing themselves to abstain from sex. And this takes energy, it takes attention, it takes even a sense of going into this denial of the desire, suppression of the desire. So you are suppressing and denying the desire. And in order to uphold that denial and suppression, you're constantly using energy, it's constantly taking your attention. And suppression is not going to help you grow spiritually. Because what is spiritual growth? There's an expansion of consciousness. You can't expand your consciousness by suppressing energy. So there are many people who, they think they're very spiritual, but they can live in a monastery for their whole lives, and they can give prayers and chants and this and that, but they're not really growing because they're suppressing something. So then there can be people who are living a normal worldly life, who are, if they are not pulled into the unfulfillable sexual desire, they are actually advancing their spiritual growth by having sex because they are approaching this saturation point where the I Am Presence has had enough of it. Now, in order to really grasp this, we also have to understand here, as I explained in several of my videos, the dynamic is your higher self is in the spiritual realm. It can't descend into physical embodiment on a planet like Earth. So it sends an extension of itself, which I call the conscious you. And the conscious you then, as it descends into embodiment, it's creating this outer personality, what I call the identity, the mental, the emotional level. And when it has those three higher bodies, it can then take embodiment in the physical body. And so we start at a level where we have some sense of connection to our higher self, but not really a conscious connection of what we're connected to. We don't really know what we're connected to. So the thing is, the conscious you has free will. And when you are in embodiment, you have a limited perspective. You don't have the broad perspective the I Am Presence has. So it's possible that the conscious you can develop a desire for sex that's beyond what the I Am Presence has. And of course, it's only the conscious you who can go into the unfulfillable desires by going into separation. So that means that there comes a point as a spiritual person where you have to use your intuition, and you also have to consider, is my conscious you in alignment with the desire of my I Am Presence? Or has my conscious you developed a desire for sex that's beyond what the I Am Presence has? And you need to consider this consciously, because the conscious you, as I said, has free will, and the conscious you also has the ability, that's why it's called the conscious you, because it has the potential to become conscious of itself and what it's doing. So the conscious you has the ability to step back, look at itself and say, what is my desire for sex? Have I been pulled into something in this world that gives me a desire for sex that's beyond what my I Am Presence has? And how can I bring myself into alignment with my higher self? And this has to be a conscious decision. And if you're not a spiritual person, you've never even heard of these concepts, or even many spiritual people haven't heard of this concept. So it's very important, if this is an important question for you, it's very important to take some time, and especially, if you have called to the Ascended Masters to cut you free from the collective entities for sex, so that you have this reprieve, it's important to step back and consider this, and just you consider the question with the outer mind, but then let it go and see what you get intuitively of how you can bring your conscious you into alignment with your higher self in terms of sexual desire. You can, of course, do it with any other desire as well. Because once you have achieved that alignment with your higher self, then you can have a different approach to it, where actually whatever you do at that point, whether you abstain from sex, or whether you have sex, or whether you dial back your desire for sex, it will advance your spiritual growth. You see what I'm trying to say here? I'm trying to say that many of the spiritual people out there have used the outer mind to build a mental image of what it means to be spiritual. So they've taken a spiritual teaching, a spiritual tradition, and they've said, this has certain teachings, this has certain practices. So they built this mental image. How am I supposed to behave as a spiritual person? Oh yes, I'm supposed to abstain from sex. So they're using the outer mind to basically suppress their intuition. Because their intuition might well tell them something different, but they're not willing to listen to it, because I have to be spiritual, I have to live up to this image. And as I said, that will not really advance your spiritual growth. So you also have many other people in the world who are pulled into these unfulfillable desires. They're also allowing the outer mind to override their intuition, which might well tell them, you shouldn't have that much sex, you shouldn't focus on sex, you shouldn't look at pornography, you shouldn't do all of these activities that artificially magnify your sex drive. So these kinds of people are not listening to their intuition. But as a spiritual person, if you really want to grow, you have to come to that point where you're protecting yourself from outside influences. So you're really in your own mind. It's just between you and your I Am Presence. And therefore you can listen to your intuition, which is your I Am Presence, giving you impressions. And you can bring the conscious you into alignment with the I Am Presence about sexual desire. And then whatever happens from there, it will advance your spiritual growth. So, just to go back, I know it's been long already, but just to go back to my opening question. Why is there such a circus around sex on Earth? Why is there such a stigma around it? Well, I have in several of my videos, including the one, How the World Was Created, but also others, I've talked about fallen beings. And fallen beings are beings who rebelled against the purpose of growth, and they are trying to create a separate self that is as advanced as possible, basically like a god. They're trying to create this artificial god-like figure out of the separate self. And as part of this, they want to control others. And I explained, there's a long story about how they were allowed to come to Earth. And they are fallen beings that are in physical embodiment, some in emotional, mental, and identity realms. And they are seeking to control humanity. But they are especially seeking to control spiritual people and prevent us from reaching a higher level of consciousness, because this is the threat to them. That's why they killed Jesus, for example. So, once you understand this, and obviously I can only give a brief summary about it here. So you need to watch some of my other videos if you really want to understand this. So once you grasp this, you realize that these fallen beings are sitting there in the higher realms, and they are saying, how can we gain control of Earth? And so they look down at Earth and they look at everything on Earth, including the physical body and physical desires. And they say, how can we use this to control people in general, control the general population, and how can we use it to prevent the spiritual people from rising in consciousness? And as a result of these efforts, they have focused on sex, and they have done exactly what I talked about. They have created all of these ways, both in the physical, in terms of books, advertising, movies, pornography, what have you, and sexual perversions also, that are meant to suck people into these vortexes of these unfulfillable desires, where people's energy are just being sucked in to these collective entities, which the fallen beings then can use that energy to gain more power. And so it's a deliberate effort to pull as many people as possible into being basically into an addiction where they can't stop themselves. And a lot of their energy and attention is pulled into this activity. And as a result of that, they misqualify energy. So a lot of it is about energy, but energy is really just a tool for controlling people. In terms of the spiritual people, they are not as successful in pulling people into the unfulfillable desires, because many spiritual people have a sense that awareness of energy, and we can't let our energies go into lower things. But then they have, as a strategy for hitting the spiritual people, they have developed this stigma of sex is supposed to be anti-spiritual. And therefore you're supposed to force yourself to abstain from it, which really is a strain for many people. I've met many spiritual people over the years who try to force themselves not to have sex, and it's always a strain, for most people. I mean, it doesn't have to be, but it is usually a strain. And so, so this is what the fallen beings have done, and they have then, on top of the whole thing, they have tried to create this, you can't talk about sex. And this is what they love. The fallen beings love to create these, I say love, but they don't really love anything, but they have immense enjoyment out of creating these catch-22s, where there is a problem. In this case, you have a unbalanced view of sex. Sex is anti-spiritual. So there's a problem. But then on top of that is another problem that prevents you from talking about the first problem. In other words, the stigma. Sex is, you shouldn't talk about it. So if you can't talk about a problem, how can you resolve it? And that means that the problem just sits there. And so when a problem just sits there, people feed their energy into it and they're creating another entity. So there are many entities related to sex, but one of them is just raw sexual desire to get people to have sex. But then there's an entity created starting with spiritual people thousands of years ago that you're not supposed to have sex if you're spiritual. And it's an entity. It literally pulls on your energy field and pulls on your energies. And this can also become almost like an addiction. So again, as a spiritual person, the you can make calls to the Ascended Masters to cut you free from this, to protect you from this, but it's really a matter of bringing your conscious you into alignment with the I Am Presence. And you can do that intuitively. But as I've explained in several other videos about how to increase your intuition, I have one of my breakthrough videos, but also others, it's a matter of going into a state of neutrality, being neutral. Because what often happens is that we have a mental image in our outer mind, and we are constantly projecting, this is how it's supposed to be. Sex, for example. We have a mental image of sex. We were brought up with it in this lifetime, but we were exposed to it many lifetimes. Just think back. Have you been embodied in past lifetimes in the Buddhist tradition or the Hindu tradition or the Catholic? Well, then you have been programmed with these mental images. So you have that in your outer mind. And what does it do? It overrides your intuition. Because the conscious you, it's like I've explained in several other videos, we create these subconscious selves. So the mental image is not just a mental image, it's a subconscious self that's pulling on the conscious you. And when you go into this, you're looking at sex through the perception filter of this separate self. And it colors how you look at it. So if you are into this self and looking through that filter, you can't hear that your intuition is telling you something different, whatever that might be. So what you need to strive to do, and I have several videos where I talk about this, overcoming these separate selves, is to come to a point where you look at your attitude to sex, you look at your mental images of sex, and you ask yourself, why am I believing this? Is this logical? Does it make sense? And you try to intuitively tune in until you come to a point where you have let go of some of these separate selves you have, where you can be neutral about sex. As I said, why should the physical activity of sex be looked at any differently than the physical activity of taking a walk in the forest? Why should there be a stigma? As a spiritual person, what are we striving towards? We are striving towards raising ourselves above the collective consciousness, what most people are into. And that applies to sex as well. So people can't talk about sex, so we need to rise above that, so where we can be totally neutral about it. We don't have any push and pull about sex. We can just look at it neutrally, and we can tune into our higher self. Take care here. I'm not telling you what to do. But what I am saying, tune into your higher self and see what's the right thing for you. And that's what we need to do with everything. And if you can get to that point, you have really made a major progress on your spiritual path, where you're not listening to the collective consciousness and society's norms. You're not even listening to a spiritual teacher in the physical. You are listening to your higher self and the teachers in the spiritual realm, the Ascended Masters that are working with you personally. And that's where you get your direction from. And that's what you base your conscious decisions on. And that's a major, major progress to be there. And then from there, everything will just gradually unfold, because you'll get these intuitive directions that will help you raise your consciousness and overcome limitation after limitation after limitation. And, just again, as a spiritual person, once you recognize the existence of Ascended Masters and start studying their teachings, you'll see that they have given many, many teachings about these fallen beings and how they seek to manipulate everything and to prevent us from going spiritually. And you can use that to really free yourself from these illusions and lies that are created by the fallen beings. And for me, there came a point where I realized that. This was a number of years ago, but I realized this, and I realized that, and I could feel it, because I actually realized I had sensed this all of my life. I was always sensitive to energy, and I sensed that there was a benign being that was always with me, but there were also lower beings that were seeking to pull on me and pull me into activities that I knew weren't higher activities. So when I got the teachings of the Ascended Masters about the fallen beings, it was a relief for me, because now I understood what I was up against, and it also created this determination in me that they're not going to control me. They are not going to sabotage my spiritual growth. They are not going to prevent me from attaining a higher level of consciousness and from ascending from this planet. And when you have that, then you can actively use it to basically come to see through these illusions, because you've got to realize one thing, or at least you come to realize one thing when you get there. They don't have any power over you other than what you give them. And they seek to gain power over you by sowing doubt in your mind, by creating all these illusions. For example, I remember when I was younger, I was thinking about this, is sex anti-spiritual? And I had doubt in my mind, and because of that, I didn't really know. And so you can look at yourself and say, what doubts do I have? Do I have a doubt I recognize? Then I study the teachings of the Ascended Masters, I use my intuition, so I can resolve the doubt. And once you have resolved the doubt, the fallen beings have nothing in you. It's like Jesus said, the prince of this world cometh and has nothing in you. It's like the Buddha sitting under the Bo tree being confronted by the demons of Mara, but there was nothing in him, no doubt, no illusion they could pull on. And that's where you want to get to. So, just to conclude here, I'm not saying, I want to make this clear, I'm not saying that the choice we have as spiritual people is to abstain from sex or have uncontrolled sex. And I am not saying either that as a spiritual person you should strive to come to a point where you have no sexual desire. What I've said in several videos is that we are moving into the Aquarian age, which is very different from the age of Pisces. In the age of Pisces, there was a certain validity to people withdrawing from society, living a monastic lifestyle. But in the age of Aquarius, the challenge is to integrate spirituality with everyday life. That means living a normal life, but everything is infused with spirituality. You don't see a difference between spiritual activities and worldly activities. And that's why you come to a point where you don't see sex as an anti-spiritual activity. You see it as a spiritual activity, as part of your spirituality. So you can be a spiritual person and you can have sex if both of you have an unfulfilled, fillable desire for it. Nothing anti-spiritual about it. I'm not trying to set up this goal, because I actually, there came to a point where I just transcended that whole image put upon it by the spiritual traditions, that the end goal is that you have no sexual desires. Now, there is of course a twist to this, because as the questioner also talks about, can an unfulfilled sexual desire prevent you from ascending? So we have two considerations that I've also talked about in other videos. You have your spiritual growth and normal spiritual activity. And for many people, it's part of manifesting Saint Germain's golden age. They are in embodiment. And so that's one thing. But there are some people, this is their last embodiment. They have decided this is our last embodiment. We want to ascend after this lifetime. And then there's a slightly different consideration, because, of course, sex is a desire, it's a physical activity. So it's a desire for doing something with the physical body. And the ascension is a process where you are leaving not only this physical body, but you're leaving behind being in physical embodiment on earth. You're leaving earth behind. So if you have an unfulfilled desire for sex, it can prevent you from ascending. Especially if it's the I am presence has an unfulfilled desire. But even if the conscious you has an unfulfilled desire and is not in alignment with the I am presence, it can prevent you from ascending. So in some cases, whether it's sex or another physical desire, it can delay your ascension. You will have to come back into embodiment until you are ready to give up this desire. Because as I've said before, the ascension is a process where you can say, metaphorically speaking, you're standing in front of a gate, and that gate leads to the ascended realm, the spiritual realm. But you have to voluntarily, as the conscious you have to walk through it. Of course, as a conscious you don't have a physical body walking through a gate, but it's, to illustrate it. And in order to make that decision to walk through the gate, you have to look back at Earth. And if there's anything that pulls you back here, anything you want to do, anything you want to experience, any desire you haven't filled, well, you can't walk through it. You can't leave the Earth behind forever. Now, so this is in this case, you have an unfulfilled desire, but what can happen, as the question also mentions, is that many people in between embodiments, and this of course doesn't apply if this is your last embodiment, but it applies to many other people. You can go to a place called devachan, which I made another video about, where I answer another question about it. And it's a level of wish fulfillment. So you can basically be in an environment where any unfulfilled desire, you can work on that. You can experience the activity, whether it's sex or having money or having a huge palace or whatever. And you can work on that so that it helps you get closer to that saturation point, both for the I Am Presence and the conscious you. So many people, many spiritual people have worked on that in past lifetimes, and that's why some spiritual people come in to their current embodiment. They don't have a strong desire for sex. And I'm not saying that it can't be okay for people to be monks or nuns or to abstain from sex. It's just an individual matter. But as I said, if you are in your last embodiment, then the important thing is to bring the conscious you into alignment with your I Am Presence concerning all desires relating to this world, whether it's sex or something else. And once you do that, it won't prevent you from ascending. Because the conscious you, the wonderful thing about this teaching about the conscious you, and I see many people who haven't really grasped this, it is that the Masters are saying that the conscious you, it's neutral awareness or pure awareness. In other words, we have the outer personality, but the conscious you isn't the outer personality. And that means that anything that happens in the outer personality, whether it's a desire for sex or something else, the conscious you can step outside of it, look at it, and you can see that it actually hinders you from going where you want to go, higher levels of consciousness. And you can consciously give it up. You can consciously give it up. And that then brings the conscious you into alignment with your I Am Presence. And if you are in your last embodiment, then this is a really high priority to come to that point where the conscious you looks at earthly activities and attains what the Buddha called non-attachment. So again, this doesn't mean that you have to, for example, look at sex and say, okay, I now give up all desire for sex. You don't have to do that. But you have to give up any attachment to it. So in other words, as I said, the obsessive compulsive desires, you have an attachment, something you have to do. But if you get to that point where it's a fulfillable desire, you can have sex, but you're not attached to it. You don't get grumpy if you don't get sex when you want it, for example. And so you see again, there are levels of non-attachment, levels of neutrality, and you may come to a point where you just effortlessly decide not to have sex, or you just engage in sex and enjoy it for what it is, but it's not pulling on you. You don't have any attachment to it. And either way can be spiritual for you, as long as you're not with the outer mind forcing yourself. Basically, you come to that point where you reach the higher level of consciousness, or you could say as you go towards higher levels of consciousness, there's less and less force. You're not forcing yourself. You get rid of these mental images of what you should be and what you shouldn't be. So okay, I have probably gone on longer than most people can endure, but anyway, if I haven't answered any of the questions you have, then just feel free to ask me.